He just wanted to fly to his granddaughter. But the flight attendant kicked him out of business class for a blogger. No one stood up for him until the captain showed up, and what he did was stop the whole plane. Subscribe to the channel and post in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning sun slid through the half-closed blinds of a small house on the east side of Atlanta, casting muted gold onto the edges of a neat living room. Everything in the home spoke of order, modest but proud. The carpet, though faded, bore no stains. The photographs on the wall hung perfectly level. A small flag folded into a precise triangle rested inside a wooden case on the mantel, its corners sharp as a salute. Beneath it sat a simple wooden plaque etched with the words, "In honor of service." Harold M. Johnson, 76, sat in a worn but clean armchair by the window. He was tall in his youth, still tall now when standing straight, though that had become rare in recent years. His back curved slightly, his posture bent by time and pain. His hands rested on a cane carved from polished walnut, his fingers long and thick, knotted with age. The same hands that once gripped the flight controls of a military helicopter now trembled slightly as he reached for a folded piece of paper on the table. It was his itinerary. Departure, Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Flight, Transcontinental Airlines TC 447, destination, Annapolis, Maryland. Departure time, 10:45 a.m. Harold read the line again, though he had already memorized every detail. The flight would take him to something he hadn't dared dream of witnessing in his lifetime. His granddaughter, Jada Elise Johnson, graduating from the United States Naval Academy. Not only that, she would be commissioned as a second lieutenant and given command of her platoon. She was the first in the family to wear the uniform since Harold, and she wore it proudly. The thought brought a faint smile to his face, one of those slow, private smiles that crept in from memory. He reached to adjust the cuffs of his shirt, slipping on his old Marine Corps tie pin. Though he had served in the Air Force and not the Marines, the pin was a keepsake from a friend who hadn't made it back from Kuwait. A friend whose name was etched into the metal, worn by time but never forgotten. He wore it not for show, but because the past demanded presence on days like this. The quiet house made a soft, creaking sound as the wind brushed against it, a signal of early spring. Outside, the neighbors' cars were already gone. The world had started moving. Harold moved slower. He grunted slightly as he stood, the pain in his lower back pulsing like an old drumbeat. He didn't curse, didn't complain. Pain, to Harold, was not new and not surprising. It was just familiar, like gravity. He moved deliberately to the bedroom where his suit hung pressed and ready. Dark navy. The same one he wore to his wife's funeral. The same one he wore to Jada's high school graduation. He placed it on the bed carefully, checking the buttons, the lapels, and the pressed crease in the trousers. Everything was in order. He slid into the pants one leg at a time, steadying himself against the edge of the dresser. The process took longer than it used to. When he finally zipped the jacket, he caught his reflection in the mirror. Time had not been kind to his face. Lines carved deep by the years, eyes sunken a little, lips thinner, but in that moment, he looked like a man who had not given up on the idea of dignity. Next, he went to his nightstand. Inside was an envelope marked "Medical Clearance for Travel." His doctor, understanding his spinal injury and the severe discomfort it caused on long flights, had signed a formal letter explaining his need for priority seating, specifically an aisle seat with legroom. Harold had paid extra for seat 3A in business class, an expense that cut deeply into his fixed military pension, but it was worth it. He couldn't afford to arrive in Annapolis barely able to walk. He would not let Jada see him like that. As he checked his documents once more, boarding pass, Idaho, medical note, he noticed the framed photo on the dresser. It was Jada at age 7, sitting on his shoulders, both of them laughing beneath a 4th of July banner. His fingers hovered over the frame, and he let them rest gently on the glass. She'd always called him "my Iron Man." He whispered the phrase once under his breath, and then slid the frame into his suitcase. At precisely 7:30, his taxi arrived. He had booked it 2 days prior, worrying that he might forget or that the driver might not show. The driver was a young man, perhaps 22, with earbuds in and eyes that scanned Harold quickly, then glossed over. He stepped out, looked toward the porch, and did a small double-take when he noticed the cane, the jacket, and the pin. "You Mr. Johnson?" he asked. Harold gave a nod. "That's right." The driver offered a hand but didn't seem sure how to help. Harold moved with slow efficiency, descending the steps one by one. As he approached the car, the driver reached for the trunk. "I'll keep it with me," Harold said, referring to his single suitcase. "Not much in there to bother." They drove in silence for the first 10 minutes. Then, glancing in the rearview mirror, the driver asked, "You heading out for work, or—" Harold almost chuckled. "Work? Not unless someone's looking for pilots over 70. The driver smiled slightly. "Did you serve or something?" Harold nodded. "Air Force. 66 to 91. "Oh, dang," the driver said, tone shifting. "Thank you for your service, sir." Harold nodded again. "Appreciate it." That was the end of the conversation. But the driver's posture changed. His music lowered. He drove more carefully. At the airport, Harold took his time. He declined a wheelchair, though one was offered. He moved with precision, checking in at the kiosk, proceeding through security with the grace of someone used to being inspected. TSA gave him the usual pat-down. No exceptions for veterans, of course, and he endured it without a word. By the time he reached his gate, he had an hour before boarding. He found a seat near the window, far enough from the crowd to have quiet. He placed his suitcase under his chair, his cane across his lap, and he waited. He didn't check his phone. His flip phone barely had a signal. He didn't open a book. He just sat, his eyes on the tarmac, watching planes come and go. Others around him chatted, called loved ones, ordered overpriced coffee. No one paid him any special attention. Just an old black man in a suit with a pin on his lapel and shoes that had been shined by hand. But inside Harold Johnson, a fire still burned, not of anger, not of bitterness. A fire of memory, of purpose. Today wasn't about him. It was about the next generation. It was about standing up, even when sitting down hurt. It was about being there when it mattered. And above all, it was about making sure she saw him in that crowd. The one man who had never missed a milestone. The one who had never stopped believing in her. As the gate agent finally called for boarding Group A, Harold stood slowly, his joints clicking into reluctant action. He adjusted his coat, straightened his tie, and walked forward with the weight of many years behind him. He didn't know that by the end of the day, the world would know his name again. But that was still to come. For now, he was just a man on his way to see his granddaughter. And that was more than enough. The moment Harold Johnson stepped onto the jet bridge, a weight lifted from his shoulders, not because the journey was complete, but because he had made it this far without incident. The narrow hallway hummed with the sound of recirculating air and the muffled voices of early morning travelers. He gripped his cane tightly in his right hand and moved slowly but steadily, not seeking attention, just navigating the world with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that life rarely moved at his pace. The scent of stale air and cleaning fluid greeted him as he entered the aircraft. A flight attendant at the front, a young man, bright-eyed and brisk, offered a curt nod, more practiced than personal. "Welcome aboard," he said with a mechanical smile. Harold acknowledged him with a quiet, "Thank you," and moved toward his assigned seat. Row 3, Seat A, business class, left side by the window. He counted the rows as he passed, his eyes scanning the overhead bins already stuffed with bags. Some passengers were seated already, sipping coffee or scrolling through their phones. No one looked up. He arrived at his seat and paused. The cushion looked firm, the space between rows wide enough for his long legs to stretch, at least a little. He turned carefully and lowered himself, easing into the seat with a soft grunt as his back protested. His cane he placed flat on the floor between his legs, within reach. He then retrieved a small envelope from his coat pocket, his doctor's note, and tucked it into the seatback pouch just in case it was needed again. He had learned long ago that even documented necessity could be questioned. As he settled in, he noticed the peace that came with being in the right place. His legs stretched gently forward. He adjusted the lumbar pillow behind his back and leaned into the headrest. He exhaled. It had taken weeks of planning, coordination with his doctor, and a not insignificant portion of his pension. But here he was, comfortably seated, one step closer to Annapolis, one step closer to Jada. The pre-boarding announcement played softly through the cabin speakers. Nearby, a pair of businessmen in matching suits spoke quietly over a tablet, comparing charts. A woman across the aisle was already dozing, her head against the window with a travel pillow wrapped around her neck. Harold looked around, taking it all in, then gazed down at the worn watch on his wrist, the same one he'd worn every day since his retirement. The minute hand ticked forward with the same quiet rhythm he'd followed for decades. On time, for once. Everything, he thought, was exactly as it should be. And then, 3 rows back, a voice pierced the relative calm. "Excuse me," came a smooth but assertive tone. "I'm supposed to be in business, not shoved into coach." Heads turned, subtly at first, then with more open curiosity. A tall, lean man in designer sunglasses and a logo-plastered sweatshirt stood in the aisle, gesturing toward his boarding pass. He spoke to a female flight attendant who had just entered the cabin, young, composed, with a carefully curated expression of sympathy on her face. Her uniform was crisp, her posture flawless. Her name tag read M. Bennett. "That's not what I paid for," the man continued, his voice rising just enough to carry. "I have over 1 million followers. Do you know how many people will hear about this if I don't get the seat I booked?" The attendant gave him a practiced smile. "Let me check the manifest," she said smoothly, pulling out a tablet. She tapped the screen with deliberate precision, then frowned. "I see that your reservation was adjusted this morning, Mr. Kessler. There were some last-minute seat reallocations due to overbooking." "I don't care," he snapped. "Move someone. I don't fly coach." M. Bennett gave a courteous nod. "Understood, sir. Please, give me a moment." She turned toward the business class cabin, scanning the seated passengers with a cool, assessing eye. When her gaze landed on Harold, something changed. Her expression sharpened ever so slightly. She walked forward, stopping beside his seat. "Sir?" she said, tone soft but firm. "Are you Mr. Johnson?" Harold turned his head, surprised. "Yes, ma'am." She crouched slightly to meet his eye level, her smile unwavering. "I'm very sorry to bother you, but we've had a situation with seating. There's a passenger who was meant to be in this section, and, unfortunately, your seat is the only available one where we can relocate him." Harold blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "It's just for this flight," she added quickly. "We'll need to move you to a different seat, a middle seat further back, but it'll be a short trip." Harold looked at her, then at his surroundings. He gestured toward the envelope in the seat pocket. "I paid for this seat 3 months ago, for medical reasons." "I understand, sir," she said, but her tone betrayed no real understanding. "And we do appreciate your service. Truly. But this is a time-sensitive issue. If we don't make this adjustment, it may delay the departure." Harold didn't respond immediately. He looked out the window, as if the clouds beyond could offer guidance. He had fought for his country, risked his life in enemy airspace, survived crash landings, and stitched up fellow airmen under fire with his own hands. And now, for the sake of a social media influencer's comfort, he was being asked to give up the one small comfort he had claimed for himself. "What's the alternative?" he asked finally, voice calm but with an edge of weariness. "Seat 29B, she replied, checking her tablet. "It's the only one unoccupied." He knew the layout of commercial jets better than most pilots still in uniform. Row 29, back of the plane, middle seat, directly adjacent to the lavatories, no legroom, no recline, no rest. He looked back at her. "That won't do." "I understand," she repeated, "but I do need a decision. If you decline, we may not be able to depart on time." The implication was clear: comply or be blamed. The surrounding passengers had begun to watch in silence. Nobody spoke, but the weight of their judgment hung in the air like heavy fog. An old black man refusing to help a fellow traveler. A problem. A disruption. An inconvenience. Harold felt his jaw tighten, not because of the stairs or even the injustice, but because he'd seen this before. In airports, in offices, on sidewalks, a demand dressed as a request, a system that smiled while stripping away dignity. He gave a slow nod and reached for his cane. "I'd like it noted," he said, voice low and steady, "that I'm giving up a medically necessary seat under pressure." Bennett didn't reply. She was already signaling to Mr. Kessler to bring his things forward. Harold rose slowly, the ache in his back flaring as he leaned heavily on his cane. He adjusted the strap on his shoulder bag, gave a final glance at seat 3A, and turned down the aisle. Row 29 was as far from comfort as possible. He reached it with difficulty, his breathing shallow from exertion. The middle seat was wedged between a young man with oversized headphones and a portly businessman typing on a tablet, elbow jutting past the armrest like it belonged there. Harold lowered himself inch by inch. Every joint protested. Every muscle remembered the years. He rested his cane beneath his feet and folded his hands in his lap. No one said a word. No one acknowledged the change. The stewardess who brought him back had already moved on. The seat smelled of cheap disinfectant and burnt coffee. The light above flickered faintly. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, letting the cabin noise settle around him. He had endured worse. He would endure this. But something deep inside him sagged, not just from pain, but from resignation. He was invisible again, but not entirely. 3 rows ahead and across the aisle, a woman in a navy blazer watched him. She had noticed the entire exchange, the soft refusal, the pressured compliance, the slow walk back. She hadn't interfered, not yet, but her hand hovered over her phone now, not to record or to share, but to act. Her name was Charlotte Hayes, and Harold Johnson's quiet humiliation had not gone unnoticed. Not this time. Harold had once flown aircraft over deserts, scanned the horizon for enemy fire, and steadied his nerves while landing a failing helicopter, with smoke blinding his eyes and his leg bleeding freely. But there was something quietly defeating in the way he now sat hunched between two indifferent strangers in the very back of a commercial plane, his broad shoulders drawn inward, knees aching from lack of space, and pride bruised far worse than his spine. The businessman's elbow to his left jutted halfway across the armrest, tapping ceaselessly on a laptop as though the very cabin belonged to him. The college student to his right had not so much as looked up from his headphones since Harold sat down, absorbed in the vivid flicker of whatever streamed on his tablet. Between them, Harold Johnson simply sat still. The lights above flickered with a low hum, and the vent coughed out air that reeked faintly of disinfectant and reheated coffee. The seatback tray bore the outline of a ring left by someone else's forgotten drink. Every part of the space around him screamed of absence, not just of comfort, but of dignity. There was no room to stretch his leg, no space to shift his weight, and no kindness in proximity. He pressed his palm against his thigh, kneading the place where the pain lived, trying to trick the nerves into calmness. It didn't work. It hadn't for years. He closed his eyes and drew a slow breath, seeking refuge in the silence behind his lids. But the cabin buzzed around him, bags being shoved into overhead compartments, voices barking orders at children, laughter that felt intrusive, even if it wasn't meant to be. He kept his hands on his lap, folded with military neatness, as though that discipline might anchor him. The pain crept in steadily. It always did when he was confined in a seat that didn't allow the slightest extension of his leg. A familiar throb started in his lower spine, pulsing down the back of his thigh like a memory knocking on his nerves. He shifted slightly, angling his foot to find even an inch more space, but the seat in front of him pushed too far back. There was nowhere to go. He wondered if she was watching, not the young flight attendant who had moved him. She hadn't looked back once. But the woman in the blazer. He had seen her glance his way once during boarding. Something in her eyes, calm, sharp, maybe even kind. But no one had said anything. No one had offered help. And that was the thing about dignity. It rarely shouted. It didn't protest when ignored. It simply shrank. Somewhere forward in the cabin, laughter rose again. Probably from the man who now sat in Harold's seat, Mr. Million Followers. Harold didn't care to look. He had lived long enough to recognize the shape of ego and entitlement. That man had probably never slept on a cot in a barracks, never flown a mission into the unknown, never patched another man's chest with trembling hands while mortar fire shook the ground. And yet, in this cabin, he sat in comfort. Harold sat in silence. He could hear the rustling of the final pre-departure checks, the attendants tugging at bins, confirming seatbacks, closing cabinets. No one came near row 29. When one attendant did glance his way, she nodded curtly and moved on. Not a word, not an apology, not even a look of sympathy. To them, he was no longer a priority. He was just another shuffled body, placed where it would least interfere. He adjusted his coat as best he could. He felt the envelope with his doctor's note press against his ribs. It was pointless now. Proof only mattered when people bothered to ask. As the aircraft doors closed with a mechanical clunk, Harold allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought of his wife, how she would have insisted he stand his ground. "Don't let them walk over you, Harold," she would have said, folding her arms, her voice fierce even in age. But he had learned, especially in the years after she passed, that standing your ground came at a price. It meant being labeled difficult, stubborn, or a problem. And black men, especially old black men, had long been taught to stay agreeable, to stay visible. But visibility didn't mean respect. It meant tolerance, a conditional kind, the kind that vanished when convenience came calling. He remembered once, decades ago, in a desert tent somewhere outside Al-Assad, a young soldier had asked him if he'd ever been scared. "Of what?" Harold had replied, cleaning his sidearm. "Of dying?" the boy said. "No," Harold said simply, "of being forgotten." That was the truest answer he had ever given, and sitting there now, surrounded by strangers who wouldn't meet his eye, in a seat too small to hold his bones or his story, he felt closer to that fear than he had in years. But someone was watching. 3 rows ahead, just across the aisle, Charlotte Hayes sat with her laptop closed on her knees. She had boarded shortly after Harold, having returned from a speaking engagement at a leadership summit in Denver. Her life had been defined by precision and planning, by being the calm voice in rooms full of crisis. She was a widow. Her husband, a Marine, had died in Kandahar. She had learned early the cost of silence. And as she watched Harold's quiet exile to the back of the plane, she felt something shift in her chest. She had seen the entire thing. The practiced smile of the flight attendant, the way Harold had tried to explain without raising his voice, the look in his eyes when he realized the conversation was a performance, not a negotiation. She had seen the resignation in his shoulders as he walked back. She had seen injustice play out with a kind face and a polished voice. She reached for her phone, not to tweet, not to record, not even to confront. She opened her contacts and searched for a name. Alex Durning, Corporate Relations, Transcontinental Airlines. They had met at a charity event 2 years ago. He owed her a favor, and she wasn't above calling one in. Her fingers moved quickly. Passenger Harold Johnson, Flight TC 447. Moved from paid business class seat 3A, documented medical need, to 29B to accommodate influencer. Flight attendant dismissive, unacceptable. Escalate immediately. She paused, reading it over. She didn't want to embellish. She didn't need to. The truth was enough. With a final tap, she hit send. The message went off into the digital ether. She placed the phone face down on her tray table and looked out the window. The tarmac gleamed under the rising sun. A fuel truck moved in the distance. Everything around her moved on, uninterrupted, unaware. But some things shouldn't be allowed to move on. Harold shifted again, wincing slightly as his hip tightened. He could feel the stiffness setting in. 5 hours like this would leave him nearly paralyzed for the rest of the day. He would make it to the graduation, but what state would he be in? No one asked. No one noticed. Except for Charlotte. She watched him still, this time not just with sympathy, but with purpose. She knew how systems worked. She knew how silence became policy. And she also knew that every now and then someone had to speak up before the silence calcified into fact. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A response. Received. Forwarded to operations. Monitoring situation. Stand by. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a solution. But it was something. She glanced at Harold again, still motionless, his face turned forward, lips slightly pressed. There was nothing dramatic in his posture, nothing overtly broken. But the truth was in the stillness. In the way his hands stayed folded, in the way he didn't even try to press the call button. This wasn't the first time it had happened to him. That was clear. And that was the most infuriating part. Charlotte adjusted in her seat and closed her eyes briefly, not to rest but to prepare. She didn't know what would come next, but she would not forget this man. Not him, not this flight. Some wrongs demanded a witness, and some wrongs, if she had any say, demanded justice. The engines began to hum louder as the aircraft prepared for pushback. The seatbelt sign dinged, the overhead lights dimmed. Harold Johnson gripped his cane tighter with one hand and reached slowly for the buckle with the other. The pain had settled deep now like a wound reopened, but he said nothing, because that's what was expected of him. What he didn't know, what no one yet knew, was that in the cockpit, a red notification had just lit up on a screen. A pilot, reading it, frowned, and the course of this flight was about to change. The cockpit was quiet, but not still. Captain Rachel Miller, seated firmly in the left-hand chair, made a final check of the fuel readings and hydraulic pressure. Her fingers moved with the ease of repetition, but her eyes betrayed a tinge of preoccupation. She was a woman of habit and rhythm, forged from years in the Air Force, honed by nearly a decade of commercial flying. Precision had always been her language, order her belief. Even now, every part of her appearance, hair tight in a low bun, epaulets straight, cuffs aligned, reflected the discipline of a life lived above the clouds. Beside her, the first officer recited the pre-flight checklist. They were minutes from pushback, but the atmosphere in the flight deck had shifted. A red notification had appeared on the cabin management tablet mounted to the console. Not from the tower, not from dispatch, from the airline's internal corporate liaison. It had come with urgency. It had come with a name. Passenger, Harold M. Johnson. Seat, 29B. Issue, veteran displaced from medically necessary assigned seat, 3A. Incident observed by Diamond Elite Advisor. Possible escalation. Rachel had paused when she read it, not because of the violation, though that was serious enough, but because the name stirred something buried in her memory. She reached toward her tablet and typed the name again, this time into a different system, one meant for internal military clearance cross-reference. It wasn't protocol, but some instinct superseded protocol. A few seconds passed. Then the record came up. Harold M. Johnson. Air Force Master Sergeant, retired. Service dates, 1966, 1991. Gulf War veteran. Distinguished Flying Cross. Several letters of commendation. Injured in combat, honorably discharged. She saw the old declassified report. The helicopter crash, the extraction under fire, the refusal to be medevaced until every man was out of the wreckage. She stared at the screen. A moment later, she turned to her co-pilot. Hold pushback. He blinked. Captain? I need 5 minutes, she said, already unstrapping her harness. The co-pilot didn't argue. He could see something had shifted. He nodded and relayed the hold request to ground control. Rachel stepped out of the cockpit and into the forward galley. The door closed behind her with a hiss, momentarily sealing the hum of the flight deck. The lead flight attendant, Arlene, was checking the coffee dispenser when Rachel appeared. I need to speak to the crew member who moved seat 3A, Rachel said quietly. Arlene straightened. She was older, experienced, her eyes sharp. That was Bennett, she said. Passenger in 3A was reassigned to accommodate a business class upgrade from economy. We were overbooked. Where is the reassigned passenger now? Arlene hesitated. Back of the aircraft, row 29. Rachel nodded once. I'll handle this. The words were calm but final. She moved down the aisle with the quiet confidence of someone used to being obeyed. Passengers who saw her assumed she was performing a routine check, but to those attuned, there was a change in the air. The captain didn't usually walk the length of the aircraft after boarding, not unless something was wrong. Charlotte Hayes, seated in row 26, noticed first. She watched Rachel approach with measured steps, eyes scanning the cabin, posture composed but alert. Charlotte's own pulse quickened. She had hoped for a response, but not this, not the captain herself. When Rachel reached row 29, she stopped. Harold was seated stiffly, his eyes closed, lips drawn tight. The light above his seat cast a thin line across his brow. He sensed movement and opened his eyes. Their gazes met. Rachel straightened slightly and took a breath. Then she raised her right hand in a crisp salute. "Master Sergeant Johnson," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "on behalf of Transcontinental Airlines and as a fellow service member, I offer you my deepest apologies." Harold blinked slowly, taken aback. It had been years, decades, since anyone had addressed him with rank or recognition. His lips parted, but he said nothing. "You should not have been asked to give up your seat," Rachel continued. "It was an error, one that we are going to correct immediately." The cabin had gone still. Nearby passengers had lowered their devices, leaned back in their seats, turned their heads. It was not a scene of chaos or conflict, but something quieter and more profound, a moment of correction. Rachel turned her head slightly. "Is Miss Bennett in the cabin?" The young flight attendant stepped into view, pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Yes, Captain," she said. "You will personally escort Master Sergeant Johnson to seat 1A, Rachel said. Bennett hesitated. "Captain, first class is—" "If 1A is occupied," Rachel interrupted without raising her voice, "you will ask for a volunteer. If no one volunteers, you will explain that the captain of this aircraft is requesting that seat on behalf of a decorated combat veteran." The silence deepened. Harold began to rise, but Rachel gently placed her hand on his forearm. "Please," she said, "let us fix this." Harold nodded faintly, his body reluctant but his pride flickering to life. He rose slowly, each motion deliberate. The businessman beside him shifted out of the way, eyes low. The college student removed his headphones, his mouth parting slightly in recognition of the moment. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Rachel steadied Harold as he turned to face the aisle. He stood taller now, not because the pain had lessened, but because something else had returned to him. Charlotte, 3 rows ahead, watched in silence, her hand over her mouth. As Harold and Rachel began their walk toward the front, something intangible stirred among the passengers, not loud, not dramatic, but real. A ripple, a shift. People moved aside, eyes followed. The noise of the cabin faded. Row by row, they passed. And then someone stood. A middle-aged man in a baseball cap, seated by a window, rose and placed a hand to his chest in silent salute. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just honored. When they reached the first-class cabin, Bennett hesitated near 1A. A man already sat there sipping from a sleek water bottle, reading an article on his phone. He looked up, confused. "I'm sorry, sir," Bennett said, voice subdued. "We need to reassign your seat." The man frowned. "Excuse me?" "Captain's request," she said softly. He turned his head, saw Rachel, saw Harold, saw the stripes on Harold's duffel bag, the years etched into his face, the pain beneath his stance. And then, wordlessly, he stood. He turned to Harold. "It's an honor," he said. Harold nodded once. "Thank you, son." As Harold settled into 1A, the flight attendant brought him a blanket, a fresh bottle of water, and a sincere apology. He accepted each with quiet gratitude. But what broke him, what cracked something deep and old inside him, was the voice from behind. "Master Sergeant Johnson." Harold turned. A man stood in the aisle, tall, lean, close to 40, a shaved head, civilian clothes, eyes shining. "I served under you," he said. "Camp Leatherneck, 2006. You saved my life." Harold stared, the memory forming in pieces. A sandstorm, an ambush, a call for airlift, and then— "Corporal Reeves," the man said, his voice cracking. He stepped forward but couldn't speak. Instead, he nodded hard, fists clenched at his sides, his chest heaving. Harold looked away, blinking quickly. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to, because something had shifted in the cabin again. This time, it was reverence. And this time, it would not be ignored. Rachel returned to the cockpit in silence, her stride calm, but her chest alive with energy. As the cabin door sealed shut behind her, the hum of the aircraft felt different, more solemn, more grounded. She resumed her seat beside the first officer, her hands moving with the ease of years as she reconnected her harness and donned her headset. The younger pilot glanced at her, eyes curious, respectful. He'd heard something through the static of the open cabin mic, seen the stillness outside the door. But he didn't ask. Some things were better learned through observation than explanation. "Requesting final pushback," Rachel said into the mic. "Cleared," came the reply from ground control. The aircraft rolled slowly away from the gate, the taxi lights blinking in rhythm with the soft voice of the safety briefing now playing overhead. Rachel didn't speak during the takeoff roll. She watched the tarmac lines pass beneath them like timelines collapsing. As the engines roared and the nose of the plane tilted skyward, her mind returned to the man in 1A, the way he had stood, the stiffness in his leg, the scarred patience in his eyes. She thought of all the flights she had flown. None had begun quite like this. Cruising altitude arrived, the fasten seatbelt sign chimed off. The cabin settled into its post-climb lull, a mix of light murmurs, clicks of tray tables lowering, and the occasional sigh of a child resisting sleep. Rachel turned to her co-pilot. "I'll be back in a moment," she said, removing her headset once more. This time, she didn't walk the aisle. Instead, she stepped into the intercom alcove beside the cockpit door. The handset clicked in her fingers. She didn't hesitate. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice clear, even and full, broadcast through every speaker in the cabin. "Before we begin beverage service or relax into the flight, I'd like to make a brief announcement. Please give me a moment of your time." The rustling stopped. The murmuring faded. The hush was immediate. "Today, a mistake was made," Rachel began, not reading from a script but from the steady rhythm of conviction. "A man who served this country, who carries both the visible and invisible scars of that service, was asked to give up his seat. Not because of error in booking, not because of misconduct, but because of a policy that, in this case, prioritized convenience over honor." She paused. The words lingered in the air like smoke. A child asked a quiet question in a distant row. The parent hushed him. "Let me be clear," Rachel continued. "We will not take off while injustice sits quietly in our cabin." A breath. "Master Sergeant Harold Johnson is a veteran of the United States Air Force. He flew dangerous missions in multiple theaters of war. He is the recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross and has served longer than many of us have lived." He did not ask for special treatment. He simply asked to keep the seat he paid for, so that the pain he lives with every day would not be compounded by 5 hours of suffering. Another pause. The cabin remained silent. "We failed him," she said, "but we do not leave our own behind. Not in combat, not at 30,000 feet. Somewhere near row 19, someone exhaled shakily. In the first-class cabin, Harold sat still, his back pressed against the cushioned seat, his hands unmoving in his lap. But his eyes were open now, and his breath was shallow. He had never heard anything like it before, not from an officer, not from a superior, not even from the VA. It wasn't the apology that undid him. It was the precision of recognition. Rachel's voice filled the cabin once more. "If that means this flight runs 10 minutes late, then I will take every one of those minutes with pride." She clicked the mic off. The stillness broke slowly, not with commotion, not with chaos, but with a single pair of hands clapping, then another, then 2 more. A wave began, uneven at first, but real. It moved from the front to the back like a rising tide. It wasn't thunderous. It didn't need to be. It was reverent. Harold did not bow his head. He didn't raise a hand in thanks. He simply sat, upright and steady, absorbing the moment like rain on parched soil. For a long time, nothing had broken through the scar tissue of his pride. Now, something had. Charlotte, still in row 26, wiped the corner of her eye. She hadn't intended to cry. She hadn't expected the story to find its center so quickly. But in the captain's voice she had heard something familiar. She had heard her husband's cadence, his final words before deployment, his belief that honor, no matter how battered, would always rise. She looked down at her phone, at the chain of messages with the airline liaison, at the single photo she had taken of Harold from behind, head bowed, shoulders curled in defeat. She would not post it. She didn't need to. The real story was unfolding in real time. Further down the cabin, passengers who had once looked at Harold with indifference now turned toward him with subtle nods, glances that held meaning. A woman with a baby pressed her hand to her heart. A teenager lowered his earbuds. Even the man who had taken Harold's original seat sat back in his chair with unease. He looked over his shoulder once, as if to apologize, then looked away. Harold remained silent. He didn't need words. Rachel returned to the cockpit, took her seat, and resumed the flight. Her co-pilot said nothing for a long time. Then, softly, he said, "That was something else, Captain." She adjusted her instruments. "It was overdue," she replied. Back in 1A, the crew had brought Harold a warm towel and a cup of tea. The blanket rested over his knees. He sat still, his eyes closed, his breathing measured. But something inside him had changed. He was no longer holding in the humiliation. He was holding something different now, something steadier, like breath rediscovered after a long-held silence. He drifted into light sleep for a time, not because he was tired, but because his body had found, at last, a place where it could rest without shrinking. Somewhere near the midpoint of the flight, a woman from economy walked forward during a restroom break. She paused near his seat, looked at him, hesitated. Then she nodded slightly and whispered, "Thank you for everything." He opened his eyes, gave a single nod in return, and said nothing. That was all that needed to be said. Hours later, when the descent began and the cabin filled again with the noise of landing preparations, Rachel's voice came over the speaker once more, this time routine. "We are beginning our descent into Annapolis. On behalf of the entire crew, we thank you for choosing Transcontinental Airlines." But the passengers knew this flight had not been ordinary. As the wheels kissed the tarmac, the sunlight broke through the clouds and swept across the fuselage like a benediction. Seatbelts clicked, bags shifted, overhead bins opened. And still, Harold waited. He did not rush to leave, because for once he wasn't being asked to move. For once, the world had moved for him. When the crew thanked him at the exit, they didn't say it with plastic smiles. They said it with the eyes of people who had witnessed a quiet wrong being righted. He stepped into the jet bridge with steadier feet, not because the pain had vanished, but because something else had returned, something harder to name, something he thought he had lost. Harold Johnson stepped off the plane with the slow determination of a man who knew pain intimately and wore it like a second skin. The jet bridge felt warmer than the cabin, infused with the scent of recycled air and the subtle hum of machinery. His cane clicked softly against the industrial carpet as he made his way forward, head held level, eyes ahead. The terminal was alive with movement. Businessmen rushing toward meetings, families clutching vacation bags, airport staff wheeling carts of forgotten belongings. Amid it all, Harold moved alone, yet not unnoticed. The flight crew stood near the gate exit. They didn't speak in unison, as was often the practice, but when they nodded at him, it was not from duty. There was weight behind their gestures now, gratitude behind the words. The older stewardess, Arlene, who hadn't been part of the initial mistake, took a small step toward him. "Thank you, sir," she said gently, and the title wasn't hollow. Harold gave her a respectful nod and continued without slowing. Beyond the corridor, at the top of the escalators, stood Jada. She was unmistakable in her Navy midshipman uniform, the white and navy buttons gleaming under the terminal lights, her posture perfect, her chin lifted with discipline inherited rather than taught. She held a sign, homemade, slightly bent on one corner, that read in large letters, "Welcome, Grandpa Harold." The moment she saw him, she dropped it. "Grandpa!" Her voice sliced through the ambient noise like a memory returning full force. He barely managed a smile before her arms wrapped around him with the ferocity of a tide hitting the shoreline. His cane slipped a little to the side, but he didn't brace. He let the embrace land fully, awkward though it was, painful though it may have been. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. "Your knees?" she said, looking down, instantly concerned. Harold chuckled softly. "I've had worse." They stood there a moment longer, an island of stillness in the swirling airport sea. "I can't believe you came all this way," she whispered, her voice catching. "I said I'd be here," Harold replied. "Never missed one yet." She nodded, biting her lip to keep it from trembling. Her pride in him was immense, but it was matched by something else now. Curiosity, even confusion. There was news, she said as they walked slowly toward the baggage claim. "Someone recorded the captain's announcement. It's already online. I got messages from people before you even landed." Harold looked mildly surprised. "Is that so?" She laughed through the emotion. "You're trending. You, Grandpa. Some guy from the back row put up a video and said, 'I watched a real soldier get honored today.' It's been shared almost 2 million times." He blinked. He hadn't noticed anyone filming, but then, in moments of shame or grace, people often didn't notice the eyes around them. "I didn't say much," he murmured. "You didn't have to," Jada replied. They waited for his bag, though it was small and plain. She insisted on carrying it. He allowed her the gesture. When they stepped outside into the open air, the sun in Annapolis seemed cleaner, softer than what he had left behind in Atlanta. The breeze was cool, and it kissed his cheeks like something familiar. Later that afternoon, they sat together on a shaded bench near the Naval Academy's parade grounds. Cadets in uniform passed by occasionally, saluting Jada. She returned each one with ease, but her focus remained on him. They talked for hours about her studies, her upcoming commission, her anxieties about being the first black woman to lead her graduating cohort. Harold listened more than he spoke, only occasionally giving a nod or a small correction. He had learned long ago that the best advice often lived in silence. When she asked again about what happened on the plane, he kept it simple. "I had a bad seat," he said, "and someone stood up." That night, in the quiet of her modest apartment near the academy, Jada scrolled through her phone again. This time, she found the full recording, Captain Rachel Miller's announcement, from the moment she stepped into the aisle to the final line that prompted applause. The camera shook a little, grainy in places, but the emotion was crystal clear. Jada watched it twice. Then she turned off the phone and walked to where Harold had fallen asleep in her guest room. He looked peaceful, his chest rising and falling steadily. The blanket rose to just under his chin, and the reading lamp bathed the side of his face in warm light. He looked younger like that, less wounded, less hardened. She bent forward, pressed a kiss to his forehead, and left the room without speaking. The next morning, after Harold returned to Atlanta, an envelope arrived in the mail. The return address bore the official seal of Transcontinental Airlines. Inside was a formal letter of apology, written on fine paper with careful phrasing, but the tone was sincere. "Dear Mr. Johnson, on behalf of Transcontinental Airlines, I wish to extend our deepest apologies for the events that transpired aboard Flight TC 447. Your service to this country and your dignity in the face of discomfort moved not only our crew but our entire leadership team. As of today, you are designated a lifetime guest of honor with Transcontinental Airlines. No booking codes, no upgrade fees, no wait lists. Just let us know where you're going. We'll get you there. Sincerely, Transcontinental Veterans Council." Beneath the letter was a laminated card bearing his name and the words, "Lifetime Guest of Honor." The expiration date read, "Never." Harold folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the flag on his shelf. He didn't tell anyone about it. 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived. This one bore no return address but had a military seal pressed into the corner. It was addressed by hand. The handwriting was steady but aged. Inside, a letter on Department of the Army letterhead informed him that, following a public inquiry and media attention, his personnel file had been reopened. A long overlooked action report from February 1991, filed during the Gulf War, had been located and restored. It documented that on the night of a failed extraction mission near the Iraq-Kuwait border, Master Sergeant Harold Johnson had personally evacuated 6 injured soldiers from a downed Black Hawk under enemy fire, despite being wounded himself. The report had been submitted at the time, but due to the chaos of the theater and an overwhelmed command office, the file was marked incomplete and never fully processed. Attached was a second page, handwritten. "Harold, you don't know me, but I know you. I was Corporal T.J. Turner, 3rd Battalion. I was in that chopper. You pulled me out. My back was on fire. I couldn't move. You carried me like I weighed nothing. I made it home. I made a family. Because you didn't leave me behind. You may not remember my face, but I remember yours every day. Thank you. You were never invisible. Not to us. General Thomas J. Turner, USMC, Ret." Harold sat with that letter for a long time. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He only breathed, as if each line on the page restored a little of the weight that had once been taken from him. Later that evening, he walked out onto the small porch of his house, the cane steady in his hand. The sun was setting over the edge of the rooftops, painting the sky in gold and smoke. He sat in his usual chair. The wood creaked under his frame. The air smelled faintly of pine and grass, and for the first time in many, many years, he felt no need to look over his shoulder. He had been seen, truly seen, not just by strangers with cameras, not just by a captain with honor, but by time itself, by history, by the country he had fought for. He looked down at his lap where the letter from General Turner rested and smiled, not broadly, not boastfully, but gently. A smile that reached the place inside him he thought had long gone cold. He was no longer alone in that seat. He was home. It had been 3 weeks since the flight to Annapolis, and Harold Johnson still walked to his mailbox every morning the same way he always had, slowly, with his cane in his right hand and the gravel crunching underfoot, each step more rhythm than speed. The routine had not changed. The pain hadn't either, but the world around him had tilted, if only slightly. The mail itself arrived with new weight. It no longer brought only bills, pharmacy reminders, or the occasional flyer addressed to resident. Now, mixed in with the usual, came envelopes with handwritten addresses, cards with unfamiliar names, thank you letters from places he'd never been. He didn't open them all at once. He couldn't. Not because he didn't care, on the contrary, but because each one carried a piece of someone else's memory, and he had never learned to skim over sentiment. One envelope, marked in blue ink from a high school student in Kansas, said simply, "You made me think about my grandpa different." Another came from a retired colonel in Oregon, who confessed that he had long given up hope that people remembered men like them. A third was from a teacher who said the video of the flight had been shown in her civics class, and the discussion it sparked had made some of her students cry. Harold read that one 3 times, unsure what to feel. Every letter he opened, he kept. Each card found its way into a shoebox that now sat beside the flag on his shelf, the one folded with perfect corners. The box had once held an old pair of boots, long gone. Now it held evidence of something less tangible and more valuable: remembrance. He did not seek out the news stories, though Charlotte Hayes had later mailed him a print copy of her article, The Man in One. A story of Seat 29B and the price of dignity. She had sent it without comment, only her name scribbled in ink at the bottom of the last page. He read it only once, but he remembered every line. It hadn't exaggerated, hadn't glorified. She had written it plainly, the way truth often demanded. The piece had been picked up by national outlets, then discussed on cable news, then recited at veteran events, then quoted in newsletters and church bulletins. The words Master Sergeant Harold Johnson had appeared in more places than he could count. And yet, in his own neighborhood, nothing looked different. The boys still rode past his porch on skateboards in the evening, shouting and laughing. The woman across the street still tended her rose bushes with sun hat and gloves. The neighbor 2 doors down, a man who had barely waved before, now stopped at the sidewalk and tipped his cap each morning. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. On Sunday, Harold went to church. He hadn't attended in years, not since Ruth passed, but this Sunday, something nudged him out the door. Perhaps it was the stillness in his house, or the memory of the hymn she used to hum while cooking. Whatever the reason, he walked into the sanctuary just as the organ began. Heads turned as he passed the last pew. someone whispered his name. He sat near the aisle where he could stretch his leg. At the end of the service, the pastor called him by name. Not loudly, not theatrically, just enough. "Brother Harold Johnson," he said, voice warm. "Thank you for reminding us what it means to stand when others sit, or to sit when the world stands and demands you move." There was no applause, just silence. The good kind. The kind that stretched like a bridge across generations. Afterward, people came up one by one, not for photos, not for spectacle, just to shake his hand. A boy not older than 7 asked if it was true he'd been a pilot. Harold nodded and smiled. "Best office view you could ask for," he said. In the weeks that followed, a mural went up on the side of a brick building near the post office. It showed no face, only the outline of a man seated in an airplane window, sunlight falling across his hands. Above him, in bold letters, "We see you." Harold passed it once and didn't stop. He didn't need to. He knew what it meant. He knew who it was for. One afternoon, a television crew asked if they could interview him. He declined. "Nothing to say the world hasn't already heard," he told them. They left respectfully, the reporter nodding in understanding. But perhaps the most unexpected moment came when a young soldier showed up at his door. She wore her fatigues, boots dusty from travel, hair tied back tight. She introduced herself simply. "Private First Class Renee Dawes," she said. "My father was Corporal Reeves, the one who stood on your flight." Harold looked at her for a long time before inviting her in. She didn't ask questions. She sat at his kitchen table like she'd always belonged there. Over 2 cups of lukewarm coffee, they talked. Not about war, not about pain, but about legacy, about what it meant to be seen, to be remembered. She left a patch behind, a small thing, an embroidered eagle. "He wanted you to have it," she said. "He never carried anything longer than that patch. Said it reminded him of the man who wouldn't let him die." Harold added it to the shelf beside the flag and the shoebox of letters. He didn't tell anyone about the moment he stood in front of it later that night, just staring. He didn't mention the way his hand trembled slightly as he reached out and touched the patch. Or how his chest ached, not from age, but from something deeper. From the slow, quiet flood of knowing that everything he had feared, being forgotten, being erased, was no longer true. It didn't come with a medal. It didn't come with ceremony. It came with a single phrase. "We see you." And it had come not from generals or presidents, but from strangers, from a captain on a plane, from a woman with a pen, from a boy in a classroom, a girl with a salute, a man in a ball cap who stood without being asked. Harold didn't walk faster now. The pain still flared some mornings. The cane still bore his weight. But his chin lifted more easily. When people spoke to him, he looked them in the eye. When someone passed and nodded, he nodded back. Sometimes he even smiled. On one particular evening, just before dusk, he sat on the porch in his usual chair, watching the last rays of sun sink behind the distant trees. A breeze moved gently through the yard. He sipped his coffee black, just the way he always had, and listened to the world go quiet. Across the street, the neighbor waved again. This time, Harold waved back first. He thought of the flight again, the moment when everything turned, the voice in the cabin, the slow walk forward, the standing ovation that was never asked for, but freely given. And he thought of the seat, not 3A, not 1A, 29B. He smiled again, because that seat, now etched into memory, had become more than a number, more than a location, more than a moment. It had become a place of transformation, a place where the world, for a rare and perfect moment, had remembered what it owed, not just to him, but to every quiet man who ever gave more than he got back. He closed his eyes, rested his hand on the cane across his lap, and let the last warmth of the day settle on his face. He didn't need to say it aloud. He had already lived it. They saw him, and that, at last, was enough. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next video to discover another powerful moment, and share this one with someone who needs to see it.